the artists that really have a breakout are the ones that are comfortable being misunderstood and just being like, I know what I mean, and I know where my heart was with this, and it's not my job to control your perception of that.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Sens Créatif, a French podcast exploring creativity and how creatives achieve transforming their passion into a successful career. I'm your host, Jeremy Kleiss. I'm a freelance illustrator based in Paris, France, and you can follow me on Instagram at Jeremy Kleiss. Today's interview is exceptionally in English, so if you are a regular French listener, please go listen to the other version of this episode. The intro and the outro are, as usual, in French. Oui, oui. This week, I am more than happy to introduce to you my discussion with Adhd Pizza. Yes, you saw it coming. If you've been following my career for a long time, you know how much Andy's work has been an influence to me. Adhd Pizza is an American illustrator, a public speaker, but he's first and foremost the creator of Creative Pep Talk, a podcast helping people build a thriving creative practice. And this, my friends, it's like honey to my ears. I know, it sounds weird, but it's true. Since its launch in 2014, Creative Pep Talk has been a huge inspiration to me. And if you are a regular listener of the show, you know this because I've made countless references to it, from the strategic to the introspective and even the psychological aspects of creativity. Andy and I share the same passion and interests. So it was just a matter of time before Andy would be a guest on the show. Brace yourself, this episode covers a lot of material as we engage in many different topics. This interview was recorded just after the quarantine, so Andy starts by sharing his thoughts regarding our global experience. Afterwards, head first, we dive into some of Andy's favorite subjects, the hero's journey, neurodiversity, marketing. He also shares his 7 steps process for striking the balance between art and money, also known as the creative career path. And among other things, we talk about the fear of being misunderstood, what taking risks implies, and the importance of being fully you. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Adhd Pizza. Enjoy the ride. And I think we are on air.
Let's do it, man. Let's make a podcast.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Pizza.
Hello, Jeremy. How about that? I never call you that.
Yeah. So good to talk to you, Andy. I'm super thrilled to have this conversation with you. Welcome to Sens Créatif, French podcast about creativity and creative careers.
I am so pumped to be here. I honestly, there's something in my soul when I am prepped to sit and talk to you that just feels like, this sounds weird, but a warm bath. It just sounds like, okay, now I can just, we have such a good friendship, and, we trust each other. There's low boundaries. And so there's just always so much warmth and there's good listening from both sides. And so I'm just genuinely excited to be talking with you.
Thank you, man. Some Belgian, French, American love going on here.
Yeah. I'm going to make Europeans very uncomfortable with with my openness and feelings and all that stuff. I'll try to turn
That's
it
great.
down. Okay.
My listeners, they know that our journey, the impact your work and Creative Pep Talk has had on me. So they're prepared. They know they're ready for the Creative Pep Talk experience. So that's cool.
Yeah, that's great. Perfect.
I usually start each interview with the same question, which is, what's that thing that gets you up in the morning?
That's a good question. Are you starting right now with that question? Is it time to run?
I am. Let's do it. Let's dive in.
All right. That's a great question. And, I love that question so much, I could take it into 18 different directions, but I'll try to take it into one. And, I think for me, I'm really driven by meaning. I'm ADHD. I'm really open about it. Probably too open. People are like, shut up. We know you have ADHD. But it just rules my life in so many ways. And the thing about ADHD that I'm not sure people know is that it has this, this weak executive function, and it's driven by interest-based neurosystem, which all that means is I can I have to be doing things that I want to do. I can't be bored, and it's it's a disease that I have. And so, when I was 0 to 18, I let that ADHD and that obsession with not being bored made me run to pleasure, just cheap thrills, basically. And that got me into so much trouble that eventually, and I had my mom, who I believe is also ADHD, and watched how that played out over a lifetime. And I was just like, dear God, I've got to figure out a healthier way to be this type of person. And I think through a lot of discipline and reflection and, a whole list of different things, I realized that joy was a much safer drug than pleasure. And for joy to exist, there has to be discipline. There has to be sacrifice. It has to cost you something. But then when you taste it, it's much, much sweeter and purer. There's no guilt associated with it. And then so I oriented my whole life around acquiring joy. And, joy comes from helping people, moving people, living a meaningful life. And so those are the things that get me out of bed in the morning. And for me, leading a meaningful life has a lot to do with telling stories to people, just because that's kind of that's what I feel like is my job on this planet. I think I have at least the first fruits of some true talent in doing that. That's just kind of what I think I should be doing on this planet. So when I get up in the morning, I'm thinking about the next stories that I'm going to tell. And those stories are sometimes metaphors, sometimes they're analogies, sometimes they're kids' books, sometimes they're podcasts, sometimes they're Instagram posts. But it's all about, in the same way that a comedian is like obsessed with writing a joke that has a very particular payoff, aka laughter, I want to write stories that have a very particular payoff, which is the experience that life is meaningful. And I think when you experience life as meaningful, it usually ends in tears or some mild version of that, chills, whatever. So that's what I do. I wake up and I think, what's the next story that I want to tell? What am I crafting? What am I working on right now? I've been working on this kids book idea for like probably a year, but very slowly, just enjoying working on it, taking notes about it, thinking about it. And this morning I woke up and I filtered it through the hero's journey, and it was amazing. It was just I loved it. And that's what, got me pumped for a new day. That's a huge answer. Apologies. But yeah, I don't know how to do it any other way.
No, joy, meaning, hero's journey, ADHD. We've already covered like so much in like a few minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, joy. And I mean, meaning is super important to me. I cannot do anything if it doesn't bear meaning to me, and I love the joy aspect. I never considered it that way.
It's a really pure drug. It's a drug that you can, you can be addicted to and give your life to. And I think that, and actually, for any people who are into philosophy, I've only, dipped my toes in, but I think it's kind of an Epicurean philosophy, where Epicurus was kind of known as like a hedonistic person, because he said that life is about like pursuing happiness, but it wasn't about pursuing, because he would say if you pursue pleasure, it often equals unhappiness in the long run. So he was all about how do you live the most joyful life, and what are those decisions? Because those are often to do with discipline and all kinds of stuff. But I kind of subscribe to that.
Yeah. And joy and pleasure are different, and you find joy and meaning.
Yes.
And the journey towards meaning is sometimes complex and difficult, but at the end of the day, when you find meaning on your way, tears of joy, and it's just so powerful.
Yeah, the good stuff.
Cool. I think that's a good transition for. I usually ask my guests to introduce themselves, but I mean, obviously you can do it. But the next question, next to that one, is the quarantine, and I was wondering if you could tell my listeners your thoughts and how you experienced the quarantine and the lessons you've learned and all that thing. So can you give us just a quick introduction of who you are, and then let's dive into the quarantine experience.
Sure. So my name is Andy J. Miller, but I go by Andy J. Pizza. That for a bunch of reasons that aren't actually that interesting. Suffice it to say, I like pizza a lot, and it's more interesting name than Andy J. Miller. And I'm an illustrator and a podcaster and a public speaker. In the illustration world, I've done stuff for the New York Times and the Washington Post and a bunch of other clients. And I have a podcast called Creative Pep Talk that I've been doing for almost 6 years. And I do that podcast to share everything I've learned about finding your creative gift and then getting it out into the world through marketing and business and all that crap. Yeah, so that's who I am. And then to the quarantine thing, I have been, I really interact with things through the lens of the hero's journey. If you don't know the hero's journey, it was Joseph Campbell found that there's this pattern in all of the world's stories, all the myths and religions that we have passed down and told each other throughout time, that there's these really clear patterns that show up over and over and over. And I kind of use that to base my reality in a story or a narrative. I think that, the reason there is this pattern isn't because it's some, secret out there in the universe. I think it's just how our brains are wired to make meaning of life. I think those patterns exist in our head. And when we base we ground ourselves in story and narrative, that's the only means that we have for meaning making and understanding the tragedy and the strife and the joy and the good and the bad and all that stuff. And so I'm always looking through the lens of story to help know what does the character do in times like these. And so right now with the quarantine, there's a big parallel to the part of the story called The Belly of the Whale. And in The Belly of the Whale, it's a time for reflection. You can think of it through, Jonah in the whale, where he was, it's a time for reflection to say, what calls to adventure am I refusing? What parts of myself am I repressing? So Jonah in the whale, he is refusing the call to go to this group of people. Star Wars, they get stuck in a cave that's actually a giant worm stomach, and Han and Leia realize they've been repressing feelings for each other. And so there's this. So for me, quarantine has been a big kind of step back and think about, as everything kind of stops or slows down or you're forced to step away, I think you have to take stock of everything and say, why am I living at this pace? What am I going to do? What am I trying to change? And for me, what it's looked like is saying, you know what? I really, really am fortunate enough to love the creative work that I'm doing right now, what I'm spending my energies on. And I'm actually not in a rush to move on to the next season. And therefore, I need to stop being in a rush. I need to stop, obsessing about the next thing and growing this thing and all that stuff. I need to step back and say, how do I not get further, but how do I do better right now? How do I, create margin? And for me, that's looked like planning in more regular breaks from the podcast. It's meant, talking to the people that I'm doing work with and saying, hey, can we extend the deadline on that so that we can actually make something worth making? And I think, it also highlighted all the things that I was doing that didn't really feel in sync with my story and what I believe in, but I just kind of had picked them up and put them in my backpack along the way. All these things that I've been carrying that were just kind of happenstance or accidentally added to my burden. And so that's what I've been doing, is stepping back, taking stock, trying to figure out, what are the things that I want to carry on? I think that's the big question, is that, I think one way or another that we're going to get past all this stuff with quarantine and the virus and all that. And I think the big question is, what do we want to take from normal into the new normal? I think a lot of people are like, we'll never get back to normal. And then I always say, like, but do we want to? Like, if you look at Twitter for the past 4 years, like, there is so much discontent and unrest about the state of things. I'm not sure we should be in a rush to get back to normal. And so those are the questions I'm thinking about, is what about my creative practice that had accumulated over the years do I want to take into the next journey?
And what is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean,
boom, straight to the point.
Well, I think that's a great question. And actually, the podcast is one. So the podcast during this quarantine, I've actually spent more money on my podcast setup than I ever have in all the 6 years put together. I set up this room in this recording space, and I bought a new computer for it, and I bought new sound stuff and all that. There was something about stepping back and looking at all of it that I realized that it doesn't matter where I go or what I do or what do I accomplish or what the next thing is, that I think that the podcast is going to weather things for a while. It's going to be around for a while, and it's going to be a key to pretty much everything I do. And it really is so squarely in what I want to be about in the world. And so that's an example of, as I stepped back and I assessed everything with clear eyes, I realized I'm not in a rush to get past the podcast. And if that's true, then I need to put the investment in to make it as substantial and as great as I know it could be. And so that's one example of how I've kind of, doubled down on something that was right. Does that make sense?
So, yes, totally. So it's been 6 years you've been doing the podcast, and you just said that it's key. It's key to everything you do. Can you tell me why? I mean, 6 years is a long time, and you want to carry on. And I remember hearing a few podcasters talking here in France saying that usually podcasts, they go maybe for 2 or 3 years, and then maybe they go do something different, at least in France. Or, I don't know, but it's something.
I mean, that's pretty true in the US as well. Yeah. Most people don't even, most people, they launch a podcast, they have all these goals and aspirations of how it's going to change everything, and they're going to be rich and whatever, and they make 4 episodes, and they're like, oh, there's no sponsors, nobody cares, only my mom's listening, and I quit. And that was true 4 episodes into my podcast. That was also true. So yeah.
And so what happened? What happened with Creative Pep Talk, and what's happening right now? And why is it so key, or why did it become so key to everything you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the first thing that comes to mind is podcasts are such an interesting location to set up your creative shop. I think one thing that we do as creatives that's not very helpful is we get so obsessed with the what, and we don't get obsessed with the why. So we get obsessed with the what in terms of, what am I? Am I a musician? Am I a podcaster? Am I an illustrator? Am I, a designer? What am I? And then how, we get obsessed with how, which is our style. How am I going to do it? How am I different than other illustrators? I have to find my niche and who I am as an illustrator, but we never build our foundation on the whole why thing. This is kind of the Simon Sinek thing, but translated. We're both big fans of this idea. It's a helpful little framework for thinking about your purpose and what you do and what you care about.
It's very meaningful.
Yes, it starts with what's meaningful. That's the why. And so for me as a creative person, I think I went through this huge journey of, I was an illustrator, and I, bought a house with my illustration work, and I got a mortgage, and all that stuff. And I had a bunch of good clients, and I'd done that for years. And then I decided to do this podcast, and the podcast took off, and I was doing public speaking and, speaking, not illustrating as my main focus. And for a while I was like, man, am I a speaker or am I an illustrator? What am I? And that started to really confuse everything. And I felt so pulled apart and in 2 different directions until I'd heard a speaker say, I want to give you an analogy right now. I'm going to give you a little illustration to explain what I mean. And he meant the analogy is an illustration. And when he said that, my mind just exploded, and I realized that the what didn't matter. It didn't matter if I was drawing, didn't matter if I was speaking, didn't matter if I was writing, didn't matter what I was doing. The why was always the same. I was always doing the same thing. I was always trying to uncover the invisible, important, essential things in life. And I was always trying to highlight them and explain them and transfer them to other people through my creative work, no matter what medium I was using. And the what matters in terms of the practical of being good enough at making illustrations that people actually want to look at them. That matters. Making a podcast, the what matters in that, getting the microphone so that people can stand to listen to it. But that's as far as it goes for me. So beyond that, I'm always thinking about why. Why am I doing it? What's my artistic voice, and what do I have to say, and what am I on this planet about? And then the medium doesn't really matter. And the reason I say all that is because creatives get so hung up on the what in their identity and the label that they don't take any note of, what the opportunities are right now. And so for me, I feel like podcasting is like the place in the city that's up and coming. So if you think about like a city analogy, you don't open a coffee shop in the hip place from 10 years ago, right? That there's 100 coffee shops there and you're going to get crushed and they're already established. If you're opening a new coffee shop, you're going to think about what's the next place where things are really happening in the city. I want to be part of that. And so for creativity, I think of the what like that. And for me, podcasts are one of the most interesting places to be making creative work today. And I would say everybody that's, from the bottom to the top, people would agree with that. I just read an article from Hank Green, who has, huge podcasts, huge YouTube. And, he prefers podcasts over YouTube, even though he's famous for his YouTube videos. And it's because podcast is still the Wild West. And the thing about the Wild West is, I don't know if any of this makes sense. You feel free to pick at, my Americanisms because I don't know if they're going to translate. I do. But the podcasts, there's just so much creative freedom. There's so much room to grow. There's so much room to define what a podcast is and what's a good podcast. And that's where you want to be as a creative person, because that's where all the fun is, and that's where all the agency is. And so, I always but then also a lot of creative people don't want to go to those places because anytime there's a new place to set up shop, there's no clout. If I go tell people, I'm a professional podcaster, you're going to get people rolling their eyes, in the fancy pants places where they're giving away awards. And that's exactly where you want to be. As soon as you get into romance, as soon as you're like, I want to be, Steven Spielberg, or I want to be Bob Dylan, or I want to be the Beatles, you are chasing, you heard thunder because it got to you and you're chasing lightning. Like by the time you hear the thunder, the lightning is gone. And so that's why that's one of the main reasons podcasts are so interesting to me, is that that's where the creative stuff's happening right now, man. And I am thrilled to be a tiny little speck of a part of it.
And you were talking about freedom, and I totally feel that same thing with podcasts. But at the same time, freedom can be scary because everything is possible and everything has to be invented. And podcasts, and especially here in France, in the US, they've been popular for longer than here, and everybody's crazy about podcasts these days here in France.
Yeah,
and it's still very early, and it can be scary to go in that direction, but it's exciting. And anyway, all I'm trying to say is that freedom is exciting and scary at the same time.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight something here because it's a way that I've reframed how I think about scary things. So early on the podcast, I'm talking about how my whole thing is running from boredom. And the reason is boredom is kind of like a lack of meaning. It's like, mundane.
Oh, yeah.
Does it really matter? You're on an assembly line pushing a button that eventually a robot will push, and you're just feeling like so bored because you don't know if your life matters. It's not making any difference. And so for me, I've kind of reframed scary in my creative journey as the opposite of boredom. So if I'm running from boredom, I'm often running into scary. And when I hit scary, instead of being like, I'm scared, I got to get out of here, and retreating to boredom, realizing like, if this wasn't scary, it would be boring.
Yes.
And that's kind of how I try to reframe it when I'm frazzled, because I don't know what a podcast, what is a good podcast? How do you grow one of these things? And, I think about it also like, I think about how if the road is paved and there's all these people along the side trying to make money on you as you're going along your journey and trying to make it easy on your road to success and your treasure, your creative goals, then the gold at the end of that road is gone. It's this idea that in the gold rush, the people that made the most money were the people selling the tools to the miners. That's that. And so,
yes.
so you don't want to be on a road where there's awards and there's and it's easy. When I first made a podcast, finding the right microphone and finding the hosting and finding all these different things, you really had to search and figure it out and fumble through it. Whereas now you can, podcasts are still, I think, in their infancy and still a great place to start and go. But now you can get an app and just record your voice and push a button and it's on Apple Podcasts. And so that, that's less wilderness than when I started in 20 years, it'll be as stuffy and picked over as TV. And at that time, maybe there will be something for me to switch it up, or I don't know. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. How do you keep it fresh and wild? And after 6 years of doing it, I mean, how have you, how did
I keep the fire lit? It's like a romance.
Fire.
Yeah. Yeah. My romance with podcasts, that's hard. And I think that, that's one of the reasons I like story so much. So I'll answer the first answer to that is the thing that saved my podcast was about 2 years into doing it. I was weighing up whether I needed to focus on kids' books, illustrating and authoring kids' books, or focus on the podcast for the next year or so. And, the kids' book path looked so good. And I realized that part of the reason I wanted that was because I wanted to matter to the people that matter to me. It was kind of
yes.
That's not the worst thing in the world, but there was definitely some ego to I want to win a Caldecott so everybody knows that I'm good at art. And the podcast just didn't have any of that stuff. And in fact, the breakthrough that I had was realizing that podcasts could be art, that they I have this idea that anything you treat as art will be. And so it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you are approaching it with craft and sincerity and creativity and all of that, you can make art out of anything. We all know, you've all had a waiter that was a master in the art of being a waiter. And you're like, whoa, this guy, how is he making our time so interesting and nice and relaxed and whatever, And so for me, that was the turning point. That was a big breakthrough for me in the podcast. Was I realized even if nobody else sees it, even if nobody else knows, to me, I know that the podcast is my art. And I will approach it like it's poetry. And I will, and so for me, that's amazing because it's just I heard Sufjan Stevens, who I'm a big fan of, say, he's still trying to write the perfect song. And there's just this elusive thing about art where it's this thing of mastery versus mystery. You're never going to write the perfect song. That's what's so cool about story. The more you learn about story structure and how to write a good story and get more tools in your belt, the more you realize how this is a journey that you'll enjoy the rest of your life. It's just like what I imagine. I don't know because I don't play sports or watch sports, but I imagine that's what keeps people interested. That's what keeps Michael Jordan interested even after 5 championships. To get the next one is, every game is still a challenge. Every game, there's a new thing that you didn't see, and there's a new trick that you have up your sleeve and a trick that your opponent has up its sleeve. And for me, when I approach a podcast every week, I'm thinking of it as another story to tell and another piece of art to make. And can I make a joke, if we're comparing it to comedy, that's so much funnier and so much quicker and so much better timing than the time before? Can I get more authentic? Can I move people more? Can I get deeper into truth? That's just a thing that humans have been attempting to do for thousands and thousands of years. And you're just never going to nail it down. And so that keeps it interesting to me. So I'm always, I think I answered it. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's always pushing yourself and taking risks also. It's It's a little idea which I'm toying around. Lately, I listened to an interview of the singer of a band I really loved. It's called, he was leading The Chariot and Norma Jean and, heavy stuff. We discussed about that when I was in the US with you. Anyway, and he was talking about, I don't know, listening to him, he doesn't give very often interviews, and
Mm.
listening to him talk about his crafts, something clicked again in me, because basically each gig that they would play, they would always start with the same song and end with the same song, but in between they never knew which song they were going to play. And basically, as the guitarist or the drummer or whoever in the band, they would start a note and then everybody would follow. And basically, each concert was just different, and which meant that the experience was always fresh. And also, in the music industry at that time, when people were trying to get everything squeaky clean, like the first album they recorded with The Chariot, it was like recorded in one take. And it has this kind of crispy and noisy aspect to it that some people could be like, "Oh, I don't know." But, you talk all the time about, I don't know how to say it in English, but anyway, it's just like, if people don't go crazy about
your buttered spaghetti.
Pasta.
Yeah,
spaghetti. Yeah, there you go. But if it's just weird, or if it's just different, or some people will be turned off, and some people would be like, wow. And I was part of those wows. Anyway, and when I listened to it, I was just like, I just want to recall that risky aspect in my life. And I know that I went into podcasting because I wanted to experience that. But I'm still, you know me, I'm somebody who kind of likes to prepare and stuff, and by the time this episode will be aired, people will know that I'm going to publish an episode each week, and for me it's also taking a new risk, and I'm doing it on purpose to just come closer to my core and be loosened a bit more, and anyways, just taking more risks to just be more creative and find new life. And it's surprising because I was kind of scared of it. And now that I'm more my head into that, which with my illustration or with the podcast or preparing for the new season with an episode each week and stuff. And I'm just like, wow, there's so much more life. Obviously, I'm just at the beginning of that new era of my work and my craft and stuff. But it's thrilling.
Yeah.
And,
it makes total sense. And actually, it reminds me of an idea that I've been wrestling with a lot and really excited about myself. And it's this idea of there being kind of two creative energies. There's a strategic creative energy, and then there's an exploratory creative energy. And, the strategic side is kind of like a creativity as a solving a puzzle. So you have an end in mind, something you're trying to get to, and you're reverse engineering. How do we get to that thing? How do we work backwards from where we want to go to draw out a map to how to get there? And I think if you think about like a mystery novel or, the movie Knives Out, like these, whodunit, like that's written strategic creativity where it's like, we got to start with the end. This is who done it. This is who the killer is. And then we got to figure out how do we write backwards to lay all the traps and everything work out perfectly. That's one type of creativity. And then the other side is exploratory creativity. When I think about exploratory creativity, the most wildly pure exploratory creativity that comes to mind is the show Lost, where, writers later came out and said, we were encouraged to literally write the craziest thing we could write without any idea of how we're going to pay it off. So they're just literally showing up and trying to explore with no way of being strategic, no way of knowing how it's going to end. And then my favorite version of this is the one that kind of does both of them, attempts to hold both of these opposites in tension, is the show Curb Your Enthusiasm, where they have an outline, which is the strategic thing. They have a way of, we know how we want to wrap this up, how all the things need to come together. That's the strategic creativity. But there's no script. So there's an outline, but there's no script. And so when they go into each scene, the actors don't know exactly what they're going to say, but they know how the scene needs to end or what needs to pay off. And so then they show up and they play. And so I think what's great about this is it's a great way of, I think there's a correlation between strategy and exploration versus mastery and challenge. And, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote this book and created this idea about flow state and how to get there. And that's what we're all looking for, that meaningful feeling of joy when you're right in the pocket, right in the creative work that you're doing that lights you up. And he said that to get there, it has to be an equal balance of mastery and craft, or mastery and challenge. Mastery where I'm so good at this and I know how to show up. And that's, to me, kind of the strategy side of like, you plan everything, you're ready for the day. But the challenge side is now it's game day. And it doesn't matter how much you planned, you got to roll with how things play out. And I've actually, that's another thing I've thought a lot about with how I keep excited about the podcast is I'm upping both of those. So I'm getting more and more strategic and planned with my outlines, but then I'm also giving myself more license to go on tangents and be like, oh, like I'm going to go into this part. And if there's a part that just lights me up in the moment, that's not really about the episode, I'm going to go that direction. And if I have to cut it, I can cut it later, but I need that balance.
Yep. It's those side quests and stuff.
Yeah.
Talking about strategy, your podcast talks a lot about how to find the balance between having a fulfilling creative career and both on the financial side and on the artistic side. And it's a whole balance. And you came up a few years with the creative career path, like a concept that you consider like being the leading to a successful creative career. And I was wondering if you could talk about that process that personally helped me already a few times. And it's something that you came up totally by yourself. And can you just tell me
it's,
about that?
I think one thing that's really interesting about it's a 7-step process. It's a framework for approaching your creative projects and the choices that you make in terms of what you're going to make without anybody else asking you to, how are you going to steer your ship? And I think one thing that's interesting about it, you saying, I came up it totally by myself, but that's actually not true. Actually, for a bunch of reasons. One is because they're all things that I just observed in other people. Like as I was trying to explain, I would come across these artists that I was like, I don't know. I intuitively know that they get it, but I don't know what that means. Yeah. And it's not until you codify and create and pull it apart and dissect it and understand what it means to quote unquote get it, that you start having an actual plan and things you can learn from. And so I was teaching at this art school class about self-promotion and marketing. And every day I would show up and I would show them a video of another artist that I felt like got it, meaning they were thriving creatively and financially in their career. And so I would show them these videos and they were just, at some point, one of the kids was like, why are you showing us these videos? We don't care about these people. And I was like, okay. And I had this blackboard moment where I put the projector away and I was like, look, let me explain to you why I
get out.
No, I was down for it. I was like, yeah, okay. All I'm saying is they get it. Do you get it? And I was like, well, yeah, but I don't get it. I need to explain it. I need to figure out what I'm trying to say. And so I went to the blackboard and I just started to explain that, I realized that, okay, every one of these people, they exist within industry, a market, and a niche. And that ended up becoming the first 3 steps. And I just realized that every person that really was at the center of, balancing their career and their creativity, they had you could name what their industry was, their market was, and their niche was. So industry, it's like the big creative field that you're working within. Think of illustration, design, music, film, writing, whatever. The big category. And you could say for each of these people, it was very clear which category they were in. They're a designer. One example was James Victori. I said, okay, I don't know if your listeners know him, but he's in the design world. And within the design industry, he's in the market of making posters. And within that market, he has a niche, which is he's the only one in that market making these gritty, funny, conceptual posters. And every single person I realized that I was showing, every video that I was showing them, it was obvious to everybody in the room. I could say, what industry are they in? What market are they? Within that industry, what market are they in? And then within that market, how do they stand out? How are they different? And you could name it. It was clear to everybody. And part of the reason it was clear was because they had made a project that made that abundantly clear. It positioned them in a market in a way that the market knew how to deal with and understand them. And so the whole framework kind of is built on this idea. And then the other reason why it's not something I really made up is that later, after I put all that together, I would see in other people's work, business people, artists, writers, whatever, chunks of the same process. And at first I was like, oh no, they have part of my process in there. Like, I'm not original or, all the imposter syndrome crap. And then I just realized no, the reason they have that in their process too, they have, steps 4 through 7 or 1 through 3 or, 4 through 6, I don't know, in their process is because it's true. It's because I stumbled upon things that are actually real. And that's why they're good and that's why they work. And so the process is you find your industry, and within that, a sliver of that industry where people like you are making a living and that you feel like you fit in with, that's your market. Within that market, you find your niche, which is in that market of all these people. You say, oh, I'm in the illustration world, the illustration industry. I'm in the kids book market. Within the kids book market, though, how am I going to be different to all the other kids book illustrators? That's your niche. And you say, for me, mine's like pizza and dreams. And there's a bunch of other nuance there. And then once you have your industry market niche, you can create a goal that perfectly summarizes, your subconscious is super powerful and it can help you accomplish goals, but it needs something clear. And so you can't say, well, I'm in the industry, in this market, in that niche, go, let's accomplish it. It's just too fuzzy. So if you create a goal, it will summarize your industry, market, and niche. Because if your industry is illustration and your market is newspapers and magazines, and your niche is, heady psychological stuff, then your goal might be, I want to do the cover of Psychology Today, the magazine. And that gives your whole mind a clear target. And then you can take that step goal and you can make a project that proves to the world that you're the perfect person to make the cover of Psychology Today. So you build your own personal project. That's step 5. And then 6 and 7, 6 is how do you start marketing yourself? How do you find a back door? You don't start by emailing the art director at Psychology Today and saying, hey, I want to make the cover of your thing. You think, okay, well, who are the people that have made covers for Psychology Today? What other illustrators have done that? Well, what did they do before they did that? What was the natural kind of path? And what are the smaller jobs and the places where there's less of a line or a bottleneck or, a bunch of, which art directors aren't getting 1 million emails a day? Let me focus on that. And then the last step is basically rinse and repeat. It's just this idea of once you've gone through steps 1 through 6, you can kind of step back and realize you probably got it wrong somewhere. So, you can go backwards and say, did I not find the right back door to get in there? Did I not create the right project? Did I not create the right goal? Was I wrong about my niche? Was I wrong about my market? All the way to, was I wrong about my industry? And if you do it right, I think that you'll be wrong about all those things a bunch of times. I think at some point, 7 or 8 years into my career, I realized I think I want to be in the public speaking industry, not the illustration industry. I want the illustration to be the weird thing about me as a speaker, not speaking be the weird thing about me as an illustrator. I know that's a lot of information. I've put a whole, 7 or 8 episode series and a whole Skillshare class about it and, a book and all that. But I think there's probably something in there that will help spark something. And yeah, if you want to dive deeper, you can go take my Skillshare class, or you can just go to episode 173 of the Creative Pep Talk podcast. And there's, I think, 7 episodes that go through that in detail.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
That's a lot of info.
And
sorry, Jeremy.
Yes. No. It's concepts that are important to me and that I'm glad to bring to my listeners. I think the term marketing is also one, that kind of puts people off. And
Can we
I
talk
was
about
wondering
that
if
for
you
just a
could.
quick second? I don't know how much
Yes,
time we
let's
have.
go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Because I've been thinking a lot about marketing because I think there's a
Yes.
pendulum that swings in your career where, at least for me, where I'm all about the art. And then there gets a point where I'm all about getting it out there and the marketing of it and getting it into people's hands. And I go back and forth. And I think when I'm in the art side, I look at marketing and I think, oh, gross, marketing. Yuck, who needs it? I don't want to do that. I just want to be making my pure art. But then once I go back on the marketing side, I need to go get something out there. I realized that the marketing is actually it's part of the art. You can think about marketing as the story around the product. And the story is, the myth of a musician is just as important as the music itself, how they found this song and what they did with it and where they came from. It's all a huge part of the way that we interact, the context for the music and the art that they put out. And so I've been thinking a lot about, again, let's go back to story and the hero's journey. In the hero's journey, there's two basic decisions that can make or break the success of the journey. So there's the yes to the adventure, and the adventure is about going to find a cure for your people or for yourself. It's about finding the elixir. I'm going to go do this thing, and it's going to solve all the problems for my world and for my people. So the first decision is, do you say yes to finding your gift as a creative? Do you say yes to putting in the 10,000 hours? Do you say yes to actually getting good at doing this thing? That's the first yes. The second yes is, do you say yes to doing whatever it takes to bring that cure home to the people that need it? That's the yes that you'd be surprised how many heroes refuse the call home once they found what they were looking for. And you might say, why would you do that? Your whole past life has been about finding that gift so you could save your people. But once you're out there making art and you get into the purity of it and you find the gift of it and you're excited about it, there are so many reasons why we don't want to bring it home. And that's the idea of, you don't want to do it justice by marketing it. You want to spend all of this time making this book, but you don't want to do any time, doing the book justice by doing a proper book tour and, making contacts and getting it into people's hands. And there's so many things like imposter syndrome or shame or, whatever it is. There's a million reasons we could go through. But to me, that's the full creative process. It's just as much about making the album as it is touring. And when you see that the tour really has the power to inform the next album, then you can see this symbiotic pendulum swing that is creating the art and then doing everything to get it out there.
Yeah, marketing is connection somehow.
Yes, 100%.
You can make,
I think
usually
of it.
It's.
Go ahead.
No, go. Go.
I was just going to say, I think of, I think one of the biggest myths for a lot of creative people is this idea of the artist that would make their art on an island, whether anybody else in the world existed. And, I think that's art making as journaling, but I also find it really interesting that, if you put someone in solitary confinement for very long at all, they lose their sense of self and they lose their sense of humanity and they lose their mind ultimately. And I think the reason is because we have evolved to be social animals. We are inextricably connected to our community and to other people. Our whole purpose and meaning, it's all tied up in how we relate to other people. And so for me, this idea that we're all kind of, one species and interconnected, to me, art can't be taken out of that context. And once you kind of see it that way, you realize that the art is just as much about making as it is sharing it. It's more about us than you. And I think the other thing that happens there is that people want to put it in binary. They want to say it's either this or it's that. It's this dual way of thinking. And to me, it's always more, everything in life is more of a spectrum and more of a story, more of a narrative, is that at first it's all about you. It's for you. It's from you. It's your perspective and it's your heart. It's your passion. But then it's not. Then it's something else. Then it's for other people. Then it's time to give it away. Then it's about connection. And then it's about was I able with my craft to explain what moved me so much about this idea? And if I wasn't able to, I got to go back to the drawing board and try it again. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's to me, I changed the way I saw creativity as it's not just a self-expression. It's also about, connection.
Yeah. And as soon as you've done something and you release it, it's not yours anymore. It's,
Yep.
There's
I completely agree.
a writer that was saying that he was telling him about the writing of his book, and as soon as it was released, he was like, people do whatever they want with it, and they understand whatever they want from it, and it's not mine anymore. And
Yes.
I thought it was interesting because very often we want to control our words and what we mean and be sure people get us properly. And I think it's important to gear properly what we want to say, but when it's out, it's out.
Absolutely. I actually think that was a big breakthrough in my journey was, maybe 2 years ago, I got really comfortable with people misunderstanding me. As long as my intentions were good and I felt authentic, there were so many decisions that I realized, I wasn't choosing to, just weird things. Like I wasn't choosing to dye my hair purple and, do these things that I always wanted to do that felt totally right to me because I was afraid of how they'd be perceived and what they might think this means or what, whatever. And I think actually the artists that really have a breakout are the ones that are comfortable being misunderstood and just being like, I know what I mean. And I know where my heart was with this. And it's not my job to control your perception of that. And actually, I'm fine swimming in the mystery of it and being like, good. Think about I'm more worried that I would make such safe decisions that nobody would think about what I was doing at all. That's a much bigger fear of mine now. I'm not afraid at all of, they might hear that and think the wrong thing or whatever. I'm like, at least I got them thinking. Yeah, I'm much more comfortable in that space.
That's super interesting. Speaks straight to me. Enjoying the mystery and being comfortable and people not understanding you.
Yeah.
So complicated for me.
I know that's a huge thread for you. And I get it, man. I totally get it because I want to share my heart and I want to connect and I want people to know I have good intentions and a good heart and all that stuff. But I think if I think that there's just something really I think if you get too caught up in that, you just won't ever express your heart because everything can always be misunderstood.
Yeah. And our heart is messy and our intentions are messy and our art is messy. And
definitely.
Why did you notice that people who have a bigger breakthrough are those people who are okay with that?
Well,
how did you observe that?
That's really great. And I guess I'll just every single time preface it with the hero's journey. But there's just this thing where I noticed that the hero only becomes the hero when they disobey their heroes, when they disobey their guides and their mentors. There's this idea of, my favorite example is Luke Skywalker doesn't become a Jedi until he disobeys Yoda. When he says, I'm going to go save Han and Leia, and Yoda says, no, you're not finished with your training and you need to stay here. And Luke says, no, I'm leaving, because that's the kind of hero that I am. And I think that there's just this thing that, I have this theory about, I have a new favorite album of this year by a band called Waxahachie. And it's such a different, I've been a huge fan of her and her band since 2013. But it's such a huge breakthrough album. And it sounds a lot different. It's a different genre really than the past stuff that she's made, but it's a huge breakthrough. And I feel like, listening to her interviews, it sounds like that came on the back of, her and her sister, her twin sister is also a successful musician. And, this album is partially on the back of, cutting ties with that symbiotic relationship in terms of, her having to send this song to her sister and her sister say, yeah, it's good. And actually make active decisions that she would know that her sister didn't like and didn't think were good. And when you do that, that's you owning your perspective and saying, okay, yeah, I get some people are not going to like it, or people are going to misunderstand it. Or for some people, this means one thing, but for me, this does it. And when you do that, that's when you're getting into the depths of your own personal taste and your own point of view. And that's what powerful creativity is all about. When I make something, I made a stupid workout video, which I put on Instagram. And it's one of my, all jokes aside, it's one of my favorite things that I've ever made. It's one of the most pure things I've ever made because it is so my taste and perspective. And when you're in a place to do that, there's nothing that makes me happier. Like I loved that, I had a bunch of friends and audience that really loved it and were, relishing in it. But then I had my cousin shared it on Facebook, and one of her extended friends commented just a question mark of like, and to me, when you really own your perspective and you really own your point of view, there's just that you're unstoppable. You can't be broken. That question mark was one of the most affirming things to me because I thought it doesn't matter if you don't get it. It's almost funny that you don't get it because that almost makes how I get it so much sweeter because I'm like, yeah, I know about this. This is my thing. And I just think, that there's this thing that happens. You have to truly come into your own and come into your own perspective. You have to be ready to not be for everybody and for not everybody to get it. And I think you notice that. You just notice that there's a time and place where, and actually I think most of the creatives that we know that are, famous, if you're not just, in a little niche, knowing all the little obscure people doing stuff, by the time we get to know them, they've already gone through that process. They've already,
yes.
And so I think maybe you only find out that they went through that process if you're so obsessed that you dig back into the two bands that they did before this band. And you're like, oh, these two bands were ripoffs and safe in that genre. And then, it wasn't until they broke all the rules that it really took off. That leads me to a whole other thing. It's a can of worms, but I just say, the two that breakout band wouldn't have ever occurred if those two albums that they did before that weren't, really heavily inspired by somebody else. Like I'm going off on a trail there, but it's going to take us to a whole new place. So I'll leave it.
Embrace the mess.
Yeah. Embrace it.
Summarize it. Embrace the mess. Embrace the failure. I was watching this Milton Glaser video about failure and how accepting failure is making sure you carry on growing, actually. Mm-hmm. And anyway. Yeah,
that's the thing we were talking about earlier of accept the risks, lean into, if there's no stakes, then, and there's no risks, then it won't be fun anymore anyway.
Yeah. And I also like to say to people who may be afraid, I say, but if you're afraid, it's a good sign because it means that it matters to you.
Yes.
If it didn't matter to you, you wouldn't be scared because it's, and so now I can recognize when I'm feeling a bit worried or scared, I'm just like, I could be on something there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one last little thing I would like to talk with you is the ADHD thing.
Yeah.
Actually, on this show, you are the fourth person I have that's ADHD, and some of them
that's cool.
I didn't know when I went into the interview, and then it popped up.
Yeah.
And I'm more and more passionate about the whole mental health of creative people, and I think somebody who's in a good mental health will be a much better creative.
Agreed.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit of your story about that and what's your how you look on that.
Yeah. I'm ADHD, which means a whole bunch of other things that are probably not obvious to people. I think it's been great over the past decade or so. I feel like autism and the spectrum has had a lot of stories told about it that help people understand the nuance of what it means and what it doesn't mean and break out of the stereotypes and all that stuff. ADHD really hasn't had that yet. I'd love to be part of telling those stories, actually. That's kind of what I'm trying to do because I don't think people understand what it means. I don't think people take seriously. I watch my mom, who I believe has ADHD, and just how hellish her journey has been because of it, and how much of a challenge just regular everyday stuff is. I always say, like, life with ADHD isn't easy, but it's epic if you want it to be. Every day feels like I'm getting ready for battle, to brush my teeth and do just the simple things that I have to do that are boring or challenging or hard because of this, brain that I have. But, I didn't realize that I had ADHD until I was an adult. And it was, all kinds of good and bad things of finding out that. But ultimately, I've come to a place where, I use this word a lot, this idea of neurodiversity. It's kind of a new term that's thrown around there. And it's just this idea that, when people say neurodiversity, they usually mean, diverse brains, like leaning in and accepting and celebrating that we all have different brains. Some people are on the autistic spectrum. Some people have dyslexia. Some people have dyspraxia, and some people have ADHD, all these different disorders and labels and all this stuff. But to me, neurodiversity doesn't mean that at all. Neurodiversity is just this idea that every brain is different. And that's the thing that's great about it. I think in the Industrial Revolution, this is kind of a Seth Godin idea, but he just talks a lot about how the Industrial Revolution was all about celebrating how we're exactly the same. This idea of, the assembly line and interchangeable parts was such a huge thing for human progress. We realized we could build a car with an assembly line, and if every spoke and every spark plug and whatever were exactly the same, then we could interchange them and sell them, and we could make things so much quicker and more efficiently. But when we started treating people as interchangeable parts, we started creating jobs that we meant, anybody could do this job. You put any human in there and they can do this thing. Then we're maximizing not our true potential as humans, but we are maximizing the most average things about a person. And I think it's kind of metastasized. It's kind of created, I think, kind of a cancer, an overgrowth of a certain type of person that, in cells, when that happens, it's cancer. And so I feel like the school systems are just churning out as many average people as possible. And of course, they're not average. Every single person has neurodiversity. Every single person is different. And I've been thinking about it through the lens of this story that's kind of been jazzing me up for the past couple months. And it's this idea, if you'll humor me with a little bit of storytelling, this idea that if an alien popped out of a space-time wormhole and gave you a machine, a device, and the alien said, I've got to tell you 3 things about this device. The first thing is it's one of a kind in all of the universe. There's no other device like this in the whole universe. The second thing you need to know is that inside this device is the most complex inner machinery in the known universe. Inside this thing, there's an internal mechanism that is the most powerful, complex thing in all the known universe. The third thing I need to tell you, though, is what it's for. And right before they tell you what it's for, another alien, but this time an evil alien, pops out of another wormhole and kills the alien before they can tell you what it's for. And if that happened to you, if that happened to you, what would you do? Right? You would do anything to figure out the answer to number 3. You'd be like, I've got to figure out what this thing is for. It's one of a kind, and it's got the most complex inner machinery in all the known universe. And yet, every single one of us are in that exact position. You are one of a kind, and your brain is the known universe's most complex internal machinery. And yet we do not take it that seriously. We don't take this idea of finding what is, how do I lean into my neurodiversity? What's weird about my brain? What's it for? What can it do? How can it serve my fellow human? And so to me, that's what ADHD has taught me. I watched my mom try to be average and fail so dramatically. And it convinced me the only way I'm going to succeed is by leaning into my weirdness and my neurodiversity. Now, a lot of people can succeed with their average skills. They have plenty of them and they can do it, but they're not going to find what that number 3 answer is. And until they do, they're not going to live that meaningful life, and they're not going to feel like they're not an interchangeable part, and they actually are a piece that is a linchpin that is required for the thriving of their community. And to me, that's kind of the purpose of being alive.
Boom.
Boom.
It's like, it's that saying, creating to unfold your inner self.
Yeah.
It's an idea that's firing me up. And
absolutely.
I know you do. You have to do, you have to make, you have to create, you have to experiment, and go find how that machinery works to find what it was designed for.
Yeah, I think about it like Superman, like super, when he's a high schooler and he's Clark Kent in Smallville, he doesn't even know he can fly. He's really good at helping on the farm, but that's most of what he's good at the start of that. What's the difference between him and super universe saving man? And the first answer that comes to mind is superpowers. But the truth is they have the same superpowers. The thing that they don't have the same of is self-knowledge. And the way that Superman finds all his powers isn't by taking a personality test and sitting back and thinking, who am I? He finds those powers under extreme pressure, trying to save people, falling off a building and then, whoa, what the heck? I can fly. Like, that's how it happens. And the art is the same. You don't find your gift and find what's special about you by sitting back and just asking deep questions. You find it by putting pencil to paper and working it out, not in your brain, but on the page, and where you can move it around and see it and test it, and getting it in front of people. Yeah, exactly what you're just saying.
And by getting messy.
By getting messy, 100%. Yes, by doing it wrong. By getting, by having a hypothesis, using that creative career path and saying, I think I'm in this industry, market, and niche, and then just being completely wrong. Like the amount of times I did I don't know how much time we have here. I feel like
we still have a little bit of time.
Okay, a little bit of time. I'll just tell you, one example of, getting it wrong that was so necessary for me was I did a creative career path project where I said, I want to try to be in the industry of illustration, in the market of making book covers, illustrating book covers for fiction books. And because I thought that looked fun, I thought, I'll bet I'll like doing that. And so I came up with a project where I was going to make new covers for books from the public domain, and I'm going to screen print them as posters. And that will be how I start getting these kinds of jobs. And so I made a few of them, and I got to Moby Dick and I made this cover, and I was really pretty pumped about the illustration that I made, and we made a screen print, and I put it out there, and somebody said, wow, I love this. How did you like the book? And I was like, I didn't read the book. I didn't read it. And they were like, what? You did what? And I was like, I didn't read any of these books. And then I realized, I don't read fiction that much. Like I read one fiction novel one time a year, maybe. And it took me going through that messy experience to realize that's not the market for me. Was completely wrong about that. That's never going to be me. But if I had just had that conversation in my head, which I'd had plenty of times before I did the project, I would never have seen that. I would never would have tested it out there in the real world. It took getting it in front of people and people being like, that's not you, buddy, for me to realize you're completely right. And so that's the that and that's why you need it. That project was as important as the projects that got me my dream opportunities and, changed my career. That was just important. Just as an important link in the chain.
Yep. Wow. Okay. God,
I love it. I've had a blast. Your questions are awesome, and I love getting to hang with you, man. What a good excuse.
Thank you, man.
Thanks for having me, man. And I'm so pumped about there's something to me about people that really do the work, and they do it over years because that's what it takes. And they're desperate to get closer and closer to the pulse of what they're doing on this planet as a creative person. And it has been a complete joy to watch you just hunt after that thing and get closer and closer. And all the things happening with this podcast from the outside, it's just been such a pleasure to watch everybody start to see what I saw in you when we started having emails, probably about a decade ago. So I'm pumped for you, man, and congrats.
Thank you. I don't know what to say right now.
That's
thank
okay.
you. And Creative Pep Talk came I told my listeners already a bunch of time, but I think I started in 2013 working as an illustrator, and your podcast launched in like 2014 or 2015.
Yeah, 2014.
Like that. Yeah, and it's been a huge influence on my work. And I know we were talking prior the podcast. I discovered your work on the Fox is Black, the blog. So it's been a while. And yeah, we've been talking for 10 years now. And here we are talking live on the Sans Creative podcast. There you go.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man.
Cool. Well, thank you, Andy, for your time. Thanks for being with me. And yes, voila. Thank you a lot.
Voila.
Well, here you go. My discussion with Adhd Pizza. How did you like it? If you ask me, I could have these kinds of discussions all day long. Many thanks to you, Andy. I had a blast talking with you. And if you'd like to dive deeper into his work, follow him on Instagram and go listen to the Creative Pep Talk podcast, starting with his series on the creative career path from episode 170 to 174. These will allow you to dive deeper into the concepts Andy and I talked about. I also highly recommend the Creative Career Path Handbook, which you can find on Andy's online shop. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with a friend and follow along by subscribing to the podcast on your devices. You can also follow me on Instagram at Jeremy Kleiss and leave a few stars and a review on Apple Podcast. It really helps the show getting traction, and I love reading all of your messages. And because Sans Creatif is not just a podcast, but also a passionate community of creative people, please do consider joining the Patreon. Contributions start at €2 per episode, and you'll get access to everything backstage, a personalized portfolio review, and you'll be added to the Patreon-only discussion group on Instagram, a kind and active community that gives me a lot of joy. Thank you, Patreons. I love you. If you want to know more, visit patreon.com/sanscreativepodcast. Big thanks to my man, Adhd, who created the music for this podcast. Listen to his stuff on SoundCloud and follow him on Instagram at Adhd Music. You'll find the links in the show notes. Also, big shout out to Adrien Grenier for the editing of this episode. It's time to say goodbye, au revoir. I'll be back next week with the final episode before the summer break. While waiting, have a great week and stay creative. Ciao, ciao.
Voila.